My name is Peregrine. I'm 32 years old and I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I never thought something like this would happen to me until that day. What I'm about to tell you has haunted me ever since, and no matter how much time passes, I will never forget it. I didn't believe in supernatural things, nor in ghosts or the kind of horror stories people like to tell. But somehow it happened, and I can guarantee there's no explanation for it. It was a regular Saturday, a bit cloudy, and I was taking a walk around the city. Like usual, I was looking for something peaceful to do, something to make me forget about my everyday worries. I had passed by that chapel several times, but I had never gone inside. The building looked old, with time darkening the wood and the stained glass windows covered in dust. The church was always empty, which made it even more mysterious. That afternoon, something made me stop at the door. I don't know if it was the wind or maybe the silence surrounding the place, but I decided to go in. The door creaked when I opened it, which made the atmosphere even more eerie. Inside, the air was cold, and the lit candles cast shadows on the walls. I walked slowly, feeling a strange presence. It was as if the chapel was waiting for me, as if time there was different, heavier. I walked toward the confession booth, one of the few pieces of furniture in the place that seemed to be in good condition. The dark wood of the booth was polished, but the intricate details were covered in a fine layer of dust. Without thinking too much about it, I kneeled. No one else was there, just me and that space in silence. I knew no one used that booth, that it was an old piece and out of use. But something urged me to whisper, to confess, maybe as a way to rid myself of some of my own ghosts. I said softly, almost not believing what I was doing, "I feel lost. I'm afraid I don't know who I am anymore, afraid my decisions are wrong." That's when something happened. I swear the voice that answered was not human. It wasn't a priest or anyone I knew. It was low, hoarse, almost like a whisper in my mind. The voice said, "You've forgotten something, Peregrine, something you should already know." My blood ran cold. How did that voice know my name? I hadn't said it. There was no one there, as I knew, and the chapel was completely empty. I couldn't move anymore, but something inside me pushed me to keep going. "Who are you?" I asked, trying not to show the growing fear. The voice replied, even softer now, almost as if it was getting closer to me. "Do you remember the last time you were here? You did something you now regret. You know you shouldn't have, but you can't remember. Do you remember now, Peregrine?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't remember anything I might have done there before, but that feeling of discomfort started taking over me. It was as if I was being watched, as if something had access to a part of me I didn't even understand. The voice, though soft, knew exactly how to stir my thoughts. It felt like it had read my soul, and that made me more and more terrified. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "What do you want from me?" The answer came with an unsettling calmness, as if I were being judged by something much greater than myself. "You already know, Peregrine. I'm not here to judge, just to remind you of what you've forgotten, what you did in those dark nights." The words "dark nights" cut through the air like a blade. Something inside me began to awaken, something very old, and with each word from the voice, I felt like I was sinking deeper and deeper into a bottomless pit. I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. The air was dense and heavy, and my heart was beating so fast it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. All I could hear was that voice, digging deeper into my mind. Suddenly, the voice stopped. The silence was so absolute it made me feel even more terrified. I didn't know what was worse, the feeling of being watched or the feeling of being alone. I couldn't move anymore, and the air became unbearably hot. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The only thing I could do was kneel, motionless, waiting for it to end. And then, just like that, it stopped. I didn't hear the voice anymore. I didn't feel that presence. I slowly stood up, as if time had frozen for a moment. The chapel was silent, but something inside me knew that what happened there wasn't a dream or a delusion. It was real. And to this day, I can't explain what happened in that place. I never went back to that chapel, and every time I pass by, fear takes over me. Something in that chapel, something in that confession booth is waiting for me. I know it. And to this day, all I can do is ask myself, who was that voice and what did it know about me? My name is Orson, I'm 32 years old and I live in Wichita, Kansas. This story happened a few years ago, but it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I'm going to share with you what happened with a friend of mine, Lisa, and me, on a night that seemed like an ordinary one, but it turned into everything but that. The story begins in a small church in downtown Wichita, an old building that, since my childhood, always seemed a little off. I've always heard stories about that church, but no one ever really talked about what happened there, until one day, Lisa, my longtime friend, decided to investigate on her own. She told me she had heard from an old lady in town that on solitary nights, the statue of a saint in the church would smile, but only when the place was completely empty. At first, I laughed it off and told her not to believe in superstitions. But, like anyone who loves a good mystery, she wouldn't let it go. She was determined to go there and test it herself. Her plan was to stay at the church until the last person left, then hide and film the statue to see if anything really happened. I told her not to go, that it was a stupid idea, but Lisa was set on it. She sent me a message saying she was going there late at night. Deep down, I knew nothing would happen, but I still felt uneasy. She didn't come home that night. When the day broke, I called her, but no one answered. I went to the church to look for her, worried, but found only the usual silence of the empty building. It wasn't a church that attracted many people at night, so it wasn't like she had gone somewhere else. That's when I found her phone, lying on the ground in the area where the statue stood. The phone was on, with the screen open to a video. I admit I hesitated before pressing play. Something inside me, an irrational fear, told me to leave it alone, but curiosity ended up being stronger. I pressed play and immediately regretted it. The screen showed the statue of the saint, which, until then, had only caused a sense of mystery. The environment was dark, lit only by the dim light from the church's lamp, which swayed gently. What I saw on the screen left me speechless. The statue was still, like always, but in the video, it looked like something was happening. Slowly, as if moved by an invisible force, the statue's head began to turn. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It was moving, and the expression of the statue, something was wrong. It was smiling, with a wide and unusual grin, as if it knew it was being watched. I froze, staring at the video and wondering what that was. The most terrifying part of it all was that at the end of the video, the statue looked directly at the camera, at the phone, and smiled even more. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I almost felt the cold, unchanging gaze of the statue on me, even through the screen. I immediately called the police and firefighters, but nothing unusual was found. The church was still, as if time had frozen. The statue was in its place, but I couldn't stay there much longer. The cold sensation down my spine was indescribable. The worst part was that Lisa wasn't there. She hadn't left any trace, no sign of where she could have gone after recording that video. There was nothing other than her absence and the strange smile of that statue. To this day, we never figured out what happened to Lisa that night. The people in town, as always, talk about the statue, but no one ever dares to stay alone there after dark. And honestly, I never went back. The feeling that that statue knew more than it should still haunts me. I know it may sound like an exaggeration, but when you see something like that, it's impossible to forget. That statue, that expression, that feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't be able to move is something that still follows me to this day. I never knew if Lisa somehow managed to escape or if she was somehow consumed by whatever was there. So if you're ever in Wichita and decide to visit an old church and see a statue of a saint with a strange smile, well, you'd better think twice before staying alone there. I know I'll never forget this. My name is Daniel, I'm 34 years old, and I live in Indianapolis, Indiana. What I'm about to share with you has no explanation, but it still haunts me to this day. It happened 12 years ago when I was 22, and my mom was part of a choir in a church here in the city. I grew up going to church with her, but I never paid much attention to what happened there, until one day, my mom, with a strange expression on her face, started telling me something she couldn't quite explain. She had always been very involved in the choir. It was something she did from the heart, and the rehearsals and Sunday masses were essential parts of her routine. But something had started to disturb her, something she didn't want to share with me at first. Every time I asked her how the rehearsals or masses went, she would always give a simple answer, but her look was different. She'd say, "Sometimes, when the choir stops singing, I still hear voices like someone is still singing for us." I looked at her, trying to understand, but she seemed to avoid giving more details. At first, I thought it might just be exhaustion or something she imagined, but then one day she said something that really caught me off guard. "Daniel, when everyone stops singing, the voices, they continue, and they're not any of the choir members." I don't know if it was the tone of her voice or the way she said it, but something inside me stirred. She didn't seem like she was joking or exaggerating. And even stranger, she seemed scared. At first, I thought it was some kind of hallucination or just the wear and tear of singing for so long, but her look was tense, and with every word she spoke, my curiosity only grew. That night, everything changed. I couldn't just sit with her explanations anymore. I decided to go to the church and find out what she was trying to hide. I knew the choir was going to rehearse late that night, so I went there, hid behind one of the altars and waited. The place was quiet and the pews were empty. Only the choir was rehearsing, and the music echoed through the church solemnly. I stayed there, still, afraid of being caught, but more eager to understand. Then, in the middle of the rehearsal, the choir's voices began to fade, and everything went silent. But I kept hearing something, and it wasn't the choir members singing. It wasn't a recording. It was voices, soft, almost whispered, but clear. I stayed there, frozen, trying to figure out where they were coming from, but I couldn't see anyone. I discreetly moved closer, looking between the pews, trying to understand. That's when I saw something that really chilled me to the bone. Between the congregants who were seated, almost invisible, dark figures began to appear, like shadows. They didn't move like normal people. They floated, almost ethereal, and while the choir stopped, they began to sing. It wasn't a common song, but a low, disjointed melody, something I'd never heard before. It was like they didn't belong in that place, like they had come from another dimension, or like they were waiting for something. I stayed there, paralyzed, unable to move. I knew that if I made a sound, I'd be seen. But I couldn't take my eyes off these figures. They were spreading among the pews, more and more of them appearing, and their voices, which seemed to carry a tone of hopelessness, were impossible to ignore. Those figures seemed to feed off the music, the melody that the choir had stopped singing. It was like, after the human singing stopped, they took the place. When the rehearsal ended, the figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared. There was nothing left. Only an absolute silence. The choir members were leaving, talking among themselves, unaware of anything. They didn't see what I had seen. They didn't hear what I heard. Those voices and those shadows, they were something I would have never believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. I was trembling, with the sense that something indescribable had happened there, something that shouldn't have been possible. Since that day, my mom never spoke about the choir again. She still went to rehearsals, but she seemed distant, like she had left that part of herself behind. I never mentioned what I saw that night. I didn't know how she'd react, and to be honest, I didn't want her to know that I knew more than she told me. Something told me she already knew, but was afraid to face it, like it was better to leave things as they were. I still can't understand what happened that night. The voices, the figures, everything felt so real, yet surreal at the same time. I tried researching it online afterward, but I couldn't find anything close to what I experienced. No similar stories. All I know is that since that day I never looked at that church the same way again, and my mom never sang in a choir again. My name is Jennifer. I'm 34 years old and I live in a small town in Texas called Crystal Creek. It's been about 3 years since my family moved here. I've never been very religious, but my mom always enjoyed getting involved with the local church, especially after we moved. Back then, something strange caught my attention about the church in town. It never closed. No matter the time, it was always open. I never understood why, but I always felt drawn to it, like there was something unusual about it. One night, after a long conversation with my dad about the strange things happening around here, I decided to find out for myself what was going on in that church at night. I was curious, yet a little apprehensive. It was late, the town was quiet, and the streets were empty, except for the soft light coming from the church. That light felt almost supernatural. I can't explain it right, but there was something about it that unsettled me. When I reached the door of the church, it was open, as usual. I didn't see anyone coming in or out, but the door was ajar as if it were waiting for me. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick, and I can't quite explain why. Maybe it was the smell of the place, a mix of incense and old wood. The silence was so deep that I could barely hear my own footsteps echoing on the stone floor. It was an absolute silence, but at the same time it felt like something was moving in there. I felt watched, but no one was around. Or at least, I thought no one was. I walked up toward the altar, where I could see several people kneeling, their shadowy figures illuminated by the soft glow of candles around them. They were in complete silence, their heads bowed, their hands clasped. Something was off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I expected to hear murmurs, prayers, anything that would break that oppressive silence. But no. The silence remained, almost as if the sound had been stripped away from the place. I stood there for a moment, watching, until a strange feeling made me take a step back. It was as though an invisible hand was pushing me out, warning me to leave. But before I could move, something happened. One of the people in the congregation slowly stood up, their skeletal figure almost disproportionate, as if age had devoured their form. Their eyes were closed, but I could feel the intensity of that gaze. They slowly turned their head to look at me, without moving their body, and it paralyzed me. I couldn't move a muscle, my eyes locked on theirs. Something was wrong with that person, but at the same time, they seemed so a part of that place that it terrified me even more. I knew I shouldn't be there, but my curiosity kept me rooted in place. Then they took a step toward me, still with their eyes closed. When they got closer, I could hear a low whisper coming from their mouth, but the words were unintelligible. I couldn't make out anything, but the sound was disturbing. A feeling of claustrophobia started to take over me. Suddenly they stopped and knelt again, as if they were a piece of a gear fitting perfectly with the rest of the figures in the church. And then the discomfort grew even more. It was as if that church were a place where time didn't pass, where the people there were present, but at the same time, they were distant from me. I started to walk back toward the door, slowly, but fear made me move even more cautiously. Before I could reach the door, something even stranger happened. I looked back and saw that all the people, one by one, now had their eyes open, but with no expression. They weren't staring at me, they didn't seem to see me. Their eyes were empty, as if something had drained the life out of them, but at the same time, they kept moving, acting, as if they were still bound to that place. I don't know how long I stood there, but the feeling of being watched, of being invaded by something I couldn't understand, was overwhelming. When I finally managed to get out of the church, the door shut softly behind me, but the kind of soft sound that you know isn't normal. There was no one else there. The town returned to its usual silence, but something inside me had changed. That silence, the feeling of being watched, it stayed with me. I went home, but I couldn't shake those images from my mind. I kept wondering why the church never closed. What happened there in the late hours of the night? In the following days, I tried to find answers. I went to the local library and asked the older residents, but no one knew anything. Some said the church had been built over 100 years ago and had always stayed open, but no one remembered anything that could explain the situation. I tried searching for more information online, but found nothing. There was nothing about the church or the people who attended it. Everything went back to normal, but what happened that night still haunts me. I never went back to that church. I moved to another town shortly after, but whenever I think of Texas, the first thing that comes to mind is that place. Something tells me those people who were there, those kneeling figures in silence, are still there, waiting for something, maybe something I can't even begin to understand. I never knew what that silence was. I don't know what happened, but something inside me knows that what I saw that night wasn't ordinary. and I know I'll never get an answer. I just left that place behind, but it never left me. To this day, whenever I hear a door close, I find myself looking over my shoulder, as if I'm about to hear that whisper again from something I'll never understand, something that will never leave me in peace.